Unfortunately, yes.
As I think some people know, we'll be moving from this room in about 35 minutes. So what we're going to do is, given that we will be moving, I'll construct what I'm going to say so that it has a sort of natural intermission. The problem that we are confronted with is either utterly insoluble or is only susceptible to a form of solution which in its form were likely to be rejected by 99% of the American population and much of the rest of the world. Let me repeat that. The problem we are confronted with is either utterly insoluble or it is of a form which is likely to be rejected by 99% of the people of the United States and many of the people of the rest of the world. Let us first start with that assertion by me. You're not required to believe it, but you are required to know that I just asserted that. Any other way of proceeding is illusory so far as I can determine. Again, I could be mistaken, and there might be another way to think about these matters. But in that I was requested to give the class, which is in one sense a kind of continuation of what Denise did last week with respect to Augustine, I think it's only right for me to state to you what I think the situation is. This is not dissimilar to what I had discussed, I think the last time, more or less, that I addressed this group, which was in something like 2008, when I continually asserted that I had philosophical doubts about the existence of Barack Obama. And whenever people would ask me about Barack Obama, I would simply say, well, I have philosophical doubts about his existence. People thought it was only funny. I meant it, and I mean it now. I do not believe that Barack Obama exists. I have never believed in his existence. And I think that people who believe in his existence are deluded. Because I don't think that anything that Barack Obama has successfully asserted from his mouth has been human. I have not heard a single human sentiment from Barack Obama from the time that he was running for office. And I refuse to act as if what I'm hearing is human. That doesn't mean that he may not be human, but I have no evidence based on what he talks about that he is. And I don't believe that that's really very hard to determine. I do think there may be, and this is an important element for us to talk about, there may be some need to arrive at a clear idea about what is human and what is not. Because there are many things that I believe that many people think are human, and I don't believe that they are. For example, I don't believe that loyalty is a human trait. Because I know that dogs and cats have loyalty, and they exhibit it on many occasions. I don't believe that the defense of young is a human trait. That is, it's not exclusively human. Human beings also do these things, but I don't believe that that makes you human because you will fight to the death to defend your young. So when I say I haven't seen a human trait from Barack Obama, there are those that would dispute with me because they would assert that many things are human that I don't believe are. I think that the idea of humanity is very specific. I think it can be demonstrated. I think that everyone is capable of knowing what it is, but I do not believe that most people do. Now, the reason that this becomes crucial is because when we talk about thermonuclear war, the actual reaction we get is that this won't happen. I mean, the emotional reaction, whatever we may be saying, we can give a lot of different speeches, we give proof, we go out on the street, we talk to people about it, but people do not believe that this is going to occur. And the basic reason they don't believe it is because they believe that the mutual and assured destruction factor is such that no one would see a final advantage in launching thermonuclear war against another group of people to the point that the whole human race would be extinct. Because they believe that self-preservation is such a strong trait, and is a fundamentally human trait that, that's what's going to happen. I don't believe that. I don't think that is the case. I think that, in fact, not only can one argue that it is the opposite case, but it's necessarily the opposite case. Apart from the fact that we keep building thermonuclear weapons, and then different ones, more refined ones, and never in history have weapons been built that have not been used. Okay, just apart from that fact, and the budgets and everything else, strategic miscalculation has been the characteristic of warfare, and particularly diplomacy, in the entire last 100 years. I mean, that's mostly what happens. That's what Hitler did with respect to Stalin. That's what Stalin did with respect to Hitler. That's what Churchill did with respect to Hitler. They strategically miscalculated. Most of the time, that's what goes on. Most of the time, people get it wrong. The French were wrong about the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu. The French were wrong in Algeria. The Americans were wrong in Vietnam. I mean, if you look at the actual history of it, strategic miscalculation is the natural, if you will put it that way, natural way that things work. Now you're dealing with weapons which are of such a nature that they cannot be called back once they're launched, and a miscalculation only has to happen one time. And people are thinking thermonuclear war is the least likely thing that would occur. Thermonuclear war is the most likely thing that will occur in the next several years. Now, behind saying that, that's why I said 99% of the people that you talk to are just like going to run from you as fast as possible when you say that, and they are not going to. Therefore, take actions of a variety that would actually reverse that. Now, this is very important because this is essentially why Lyndon LaRouche, as an individual, has been the most terrifying conceptual force in America. It's not because he's personally terrifying. It's because he refuses to say anything other than these sorts of truths. So what happens is that people don't want to face that. They don't want to hear it. Yep. And therefore, they pursue not merely lesser truths, but delusions or illusions. Now, Denise Ham has been introduced the topic of St. Augustine's free choice of the will. This was a dialogue. I think many of you were here last week. And it's a dialogue that Augustine wrote sometime between 384 and 389 AD. This was the period when he was converting to Christianity, but he had not yet made the full conversion. That is, he had decided he was a Christian, but he wrote a series of dialogues in which what he was concerned to do was to move beyond belief to reason. In other words, what he was doing in his dialogues was he was saying, okay, yeah, we believe this, I've converted to a belief, but what about people that, like me, didn't believe this before? How do they get to believe this? What do they do? How do I actually demonstrate through reason that the decisions that I've made or I'm making are accessible or intelligible to people that don't believe? How can you know as opposed to believe? Now this is sort of important because, as an example, there's something that we often use correctly. We have to use, I think, in America today. We refer to, and Americans refer to it, called the Declaration of Independence. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And then it goes on and says many things. Actually, Lyndon LaRouche holds no truth to be self-evident. This doesn't mean that we don't agree with what follows in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the just consent of the governed, that whenever any government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation upon such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall best seem to serve their safety and happiness. Now, we don't disagree, but we don't think that's self-evident. Does that mean we think we should overthrow the Declaration of Independence or the principle of it or refer to it? No, you can't do that in this population. You can't even discuss it in this population. But it is not true that truths are self-evident. Similarly, there's a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Lyndon LaRouche does not believe that there should be a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Why? Because it's in the document. Everything that is in the Bill of Rights is in the document, but it is not explicitly laid out and stated. Why is it not? Because the preamble of the document is all that's necessary as a principle to understand what follows in the Bill of Rights. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare of ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish. Which is interesting, right? That's a religious term, isn't it?
Ordain, yeah.
Do ordain and establish. We do this as the people of the United States. Well, as a corollary, this is not Lyndon LaRouche, but I'd like to just assert this, another assertion. These things I do not expect you to agree with necessarily, but I think it's important to know what the premise is of what I'm going to be talking about. I don't believe that citizenship in the United States comes from being born in it. I don't think that's true. I think citizenship in the United States is something that one has to earn. I think it actually requires actions that one states, or rather or demonstrates, which mean that one is a citizen. I don't mean that people who are born in the United States should have to qualify to be citizens in the sense that they can't fill out papers or they can't do things until they have that right. That's not my point. But I'm trying to say something here about the nature of the concepts that we're talking about and the nature of the concepts that Augustine was talking about. Now, this dialogue is called On Free Choice of the Will. Why is that important? Well, when you say that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, at least the second one seems to presume freedom, right, is one of the things you're saying is self-evident. Well, but there's a problem. And this comes up in the dialogue at the very beginning, and I think Denise went through this last week, which is, if man is free, and if God is good, how come there's evil in the world? Right? Because evil creates situations where the freedom of man is compromised, and, obviously it's the opposite of good. So where'd it come from? And in the course of the dialogue, actually at the very beginning of the dialogue, Augustine says, well, it clearly didn't come from God, because if God is good, then God is not evil. So it's got to come from man. But then the person he's talking to is a young man named Evodius. And he's trying to convert him, basically, right? And they're having this talk. And so Evodius is away with it. So it comes from man, but man comes from God. So if evil comes from man, but man comes from God, how come evil doesn't come from God? So there's a discussion about this. And essentially, this idea of free choice becomes the pivot of the discussion. Now, Augustine says something there which you may or may not agree with, and it's of relevance to where we are, what we're talking about here. He says, well, man has to have free choice, because if he didn't have free choice, he couldn't do good. And Evodius says, what? And so he says, well, simple. See, do animals do good? Or do they just do what they are instinctively required to do? Huh? I mean, when a mongoose kicks the hell out of a snake and kills him, is the mongoose evil because he's killing the snake?
No.
The mongoose is doing what the mongoose is supposed to be doing, right? He's wired for that. That act is not an act of good or evil. So, Augustine's saying, if man did not have free will, then whatever he did would be neither good nor evil. It's just what you would do, because it's what you have the instinct to do. So in order to do good, you have to have free will. God's nature is such, he argues, that man, in order to make intelligible to himself the nature of God, this is the capacity that free will allows man. But if you got free will, you can also do the opposite.
Yes.
Now that has nothing, so Augustine says that has nothing to do with God. That's you deciding to do other than what's good. But if you don't have that capacity, there's no way for you to do the good. Now, what is this issue of the good? Well, many things could be said, but I want to just keep it, in this sense, restricted. What we know is, if we say that something is better than something else, then it means, apparently, that that thing which is better has a greater power in some way than the thing which is lesser. Some capacity is there in that which is better than that which is not. So if we say that a Model T Ford, is not as good as a Jaguar, we're saying something about the nature of a Jaguar and the nature of a Model T Ford. If we say that a tenement apartment in East New York is not as good as living on the Upper East Side of New York, we're saying there's some capacity or power you have that's greater because you live up there. Now, whether one agrees with that or not, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm saying that the issue of that which is better or good seems to have something to do with the idea of power or capacity. So if we talk about, for example, the BRICS countries, Brazil or Russia or China, whatever, and we say China has a better rail system than the United States, and it's building magnetically levitated trains, so forth and so on, we're saying that there is some capacity to do good which exists in China that does not exist in the United States. Maybe that good is restricted to transportation and how fast you can basically get to the airport and not, and things like that. But nonetheless, that is what we seem to be implying, some relationship between power, the power to act, and the power to change one's actions, then exists in that which is lesser. So good and power have some relation. So Augustine says at one point, he says, well, see, this gets interesting. He says, now, if I come up with ways or things that are more powerful, then it means I have an idea about an increase or an improvement or a development of power. Then that means, if I can say, what about that which is all powerful? If I have a concept of that, says, then that must be better than being less powerful. So that would be good. They go back and forth, they talk about this. Last night, Lyndon LaRouche said something, and I want to refer to that. He was in the middle of a discussion, he was answering a question, and I'll just go to what the last part of the question was. And this was Matthew, I think, who said to him, my question is the sun now setting on the British Empire? And what can we do to hasten its demise? Okay? So LaRouche says, now the British Empire has to be, we have to get rid of it, period. There's no question about that. The problem here is that people are still thinking in terms of the relics of the system of empire. They're thinking of monarchies and empires. Now, in point of fact, this may look good to some people, the naive, but they don't think clearly enough. What we're talking about, we want to eliminate the entire system of government, which we have found dumped on us in various forms. Now, that does not mean we are opposed to cleaning up the mess in various parts of the world. Yes, we definitely want to clean up the mess, but how do we intend to do it? Do we intend to create a formation of sovereign nation states? Are sovereign nation states a solution? I would say no. I would say that's another trick to catch us again. What we want to do is eliminate certain features of government on this planet permanently. Now that means that we want to create an international community of common interest, and that we want to share a discussion and a discovery of what that common interest is. Not just a common interest, but thinking into the future, thinking into several generations ahead. In other words, personal development is not really very good these days. What happens in various societies is not really good. It's a sham. It's makeshift. What you want to do is evolve a form of government of the type we would imagine that we would want. But we want that kind of government, the kind of government that frees us from the traditions of the old systems of rule, and that has to come and that can come. What did he say? Let's repeat that. Do we intend to create a formation of sovereign nation states? Are sovereign nation states a solution? I would say no. Now look at our literature, go back over years of what has been said, and tell me if you've seen that before. Okay, let's go to Augustine. This is first chapter, free choice of the will. Okay, this is in the section, I'm just one section over. Yeah, here I am. Section 6, eternal law and human law. Okay, so there's a discussion going on. And Evodius and Augustine are talking. So, Augustine asks a question. He says, first, tell me whether the law that is published in writing is helpful to men. And Evodius says, of course, because nations and states are composed of these men. And he says, Augustine says, are these men and nations of such a nature that they are completely eternal, neither passing away or changing, or are these nations and men mutable and subject to time? And Evodius says, well, they're mutable, they are a prey to time. So Augustine then says, therefore, if a nation is well ordered and serious, a most watchful guardian of the common interest, whose every citizen places the public good above his private interest, is not the law rightly made under which the people are allowed to elect magistrates of their own choice, through whom their own welfare, that is the public welfare, what we would call the general welfare, is administered? So Evodius says, yes, that's right. Then Augustine says, further, if this same nation gradually becomes depraved, preferring private welfare to public welfare, buying and selling votes, being corrupted by men who love power, and finally turning its government over to evil men and criminals, isn't it right that at such a time a good man who is outstanding and has the greatest ability should take the power of conferring offices from this people and reduce the government to a few noblemen or even to one? Evodius, it is right. Augustine, therefore, although these two laws seem to be opposed to each other, in that the one gives to the people the power of conferring offices, and the other takes it away, and although the second law is made so that both laws cannot exist at the same time in the same state, still we would not say, would we, that either law is unjust and ought not to be enforced? And Evodius says, by no means. Augustine then says, therefore, if you agree, let us call a law temporal, when although it is just, it can justly be changed in the course of time. Temporal law. We are mutable. We are governed by temporal laws. That's why the Declaration of Independence says, if you have a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, which evinces a desire to place the people under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. And I will submit to you that we are in exactly that situation right now. A long train of abuses and usurpations, evincing a design to reduce them to absolute subjugation. You are in that situation and have been since September 11th of 2001. You have been living in a dictatorship in the United States since 2001. The character of the United States is the same as that which people purport to be the character of what they keep calling communist China. You know how when you start talking to people about the great Chinese developments, they say, China, that's communist. Well, what it is they mean is exactly what they live in here, which they have no intention of doing anything about. We know that because we've been talking about and organizing around 28 pages that a bunch of the families of the 9/11 victims have been asking for ever since 2009 when Obama said he would give them to him. We're in New York City and we can't find even 1,000 people to get together and come to meetings like this to get the pages that, number one, the man that ran the committee says should be released, Senator Bob Graham. Members of the committee say should be released. Congressmen should say that it should be released. The families say they should be released. And we can't get 1,000 people in the city where all the people got killed and are lying at the bottom of that thing right now in the ashes. We can't get them to show up. And you want to tell me that people in America believe in free choice and free choice of the will. You want to tell me that they are citizens. I'm still looking for them. I don't see that. So I think this is important to understand because when you talk about this idea of forms of government, yes, of course we believe in the idea of a democratic republic, and yes, we believe that every citizen is capable of not merely assimilating profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, but also communicating them and developing them. We believe that. But it is also true that this may be one of the worst generations of Americans ever to exist. Now, Lyndon LaRouche once said, when I said that, he said, you know what, but that's irrelevant. Yeah, I said this, I went through this one time, it was on a conference call, and I said, you know, these people out here, I mean, look at it. What do you say to these people? He said, that's irrelevant.
No.
And here's why he was saying it. The question is, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because the idea here, coming back to Augustine on the question of evil, he contends at the beginning of the dialogue. Again, remember, all these things I'm saying, I am not telling you to accept them. I'm simply asserting to you elements of what is stated. He says, evil is not learned. He says, look, anything that's learned, if you understand it, it's good. Because if you actually understand the nature of power, you know that that which is good has more power than that which is not. So, for example, that is Augustine claims, evil is always a form of lust. And lust is always the desire for something that can be taken from you. Mm-hmm. Something that does not continue. Something that is transitional or ephemeral. But you have a desire for it. So whether that's sexual, or whether that's financial, or whether that's fame, right? Remember the famous 1967 76ers team of Wilt Chamberlain and Hal Greer? No, you don't. See? I mean, so you have this desire for these things that become, right? I mean, think about it, right? Once upon a time, Olivia de Havilland was the shit, as they said, right? Most people even don't know who was. Like, the dance, but they're shaking his head, has no idea. People in the front row know what I'm talking about. Right? Greta Garbo, Claudette Colbert, right? These people were like really famous. You're like, when you say Beyonce, it's like you said something. No, you did not. You said nothing. When you say the word Beyonce, you say nothing. When you say Jay-Z, you say nothing. When you say Barack Obama, you say nothing. And that's what Augustine says is the nature of evil. Evil is the pursuit through lust of those things that can be taken from you at any time. And the free man is the man who is in pursuit of the things that cannot be taken from you. The things that are unchanging. They are immutable. We ready to move? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, this is from Lyndon LaRouche, from something written back in the 1980s. It says, in one sense, all human knowledge can be defined as a matter of language. Let me first of all just recall, as we went to break, what happened was that Bruce Coatney said something. Bruce, why don't you repeat what you said from Maya Angelou, just so we have that for everybody.
If you know better, you can do better. Quote from Angelou, the late Maya.
Yeah, if you know better, you can do better. So the idea here is that knowledge of the good results in the capacity to do good. LaRouche said the following in the article I'm quoting from. This was let me just get the actual title. It's called Saving Our Children, Reintroducing Classical Education to the Secondary Classroom. And it was an open letter written by LaRouche to Albert Shanker, President of the United Federation of Teachers, back in 1985, U of T of New York. He said, in one sense, all human knowledge can be defined as a matter of language. Analytically, today, this view of language may begin with study of the physiology of the processes of perception. Instead of accepting naive sense certainty, physics' evidence obliges us to recognize that our perceptual images are topological encodings of experience. Don't worry about it, we'll get to what that means. Topological encodings of experience. Thus, even thought itself is a language. Just as there must be a correspondence between experience and the language of thought, so there must be a correspondence between the language of thought and the language of communication among persons. I'll read that last part again. Just as there must be a correspondence between experience and the language of thought, so there must be a correspondence between the language of thought and the language of communication among persons. Larouche has spoken often, and in particular in a paper called On the Subject of Metaphor, about the idea that no one actually can communicate an idea directly to anyone else. That all ideas that you have, including whatever you may be gleaning from what I'm saying right now, are being relatively instantaneously reproduced or reconstructed in your mind. Now, actually what you're reconstructing in your mind is unique with respect to what I'm saying. It is not the way, or in the terms that I'm actually expressing. But in fact, it's an independent action of cognition on your part. And the language is merely a way of signaling that process. I'm not speaking here in computerese, but I'm speaking about the idea that this notion he puts forward of a language of thought is different than the language of communication of thought. Now, in order for this to become sensuous, let's get into an example of this. We're going to play this first example because we need this sort of example. This is Pablo Casals, the cellist, doing a master class. This example is about 9 minutes, and you will approximately 6 minutes into it, I believe, be presented by him for exactly why this is exactly the example that should be used. So if I can have the tape at this point.
You're not exactly what he's written, but it means that. I see a lot, ya da 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 da, da ya da. And this is for work or something. If the expression is there, don't think that it is there. It's there. In the book. After that, you must take a breath here. Take a breath here.
All right. So, what did you see? Now, this is actually a question. There's several things. Yeah, Bruce.
Well, when I was looking at it, I was looking at the music, but I thought about, it might sound a little corny, but I thought about Joseph Campbell and George Lucas of Star Wars. Obi-Wan teaching Princess Leia how to play the cello.
Mm-hmm.
And she had to follow his guidance
Mm-hmm.
in order to master the cello.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
Okay, fine.
interpretation.
Fine, yeah. Alvin first and then Eugene.
I was reminded of the couple of times that I've sat in choral rehearsals where what appeared to me to sound all right until John, or whomever was conducting, went to see him point these things out, particularly the phrasing, the timing, in particular, a lot of the phrasing of it so that you could begin to actually understand whatever the composer was trying to communicate. So I was just reminded of that, and then the real difference, and the sense of even as an audience member being happy that it was coming together as that young person began to demonstrate that he was actually working through and understanding what it was he was actually supposed to be performing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Eugene.
Well, I saw that he was trying in a way to get her to be more exact, to play it exactly the way he plays. That's the way I interpret it. That's probably what was going on, as you were saying, in the language in his mind, but he couldn't communicate it to her that way, so he communicated to her in a different way, saying the composer wrote it like this, wants this, but I guess unconsciously he was trying to get her to play exactly the way he was playing. I may be wrong
Okay,
regarding that.
fine, no problem. Anybody else? What else did you actually see? What happened?
Well, he was very, very precise about what he was doing.
Mhm.
He instructed
Yeah.
to the student. Okay, and he was trying to communicate to him specifically how it should be done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, very precise, yes.
I think it was persistent.
Persistence. Persistence. Okay. Anybody else?
Did you have something?
Yeah.
Hold on, Marcel, and then over here.
Just a little side note that I think although it was a very serious pursuit, he used humor at times
Mm-hmm.
to try to get the younger person to relax and become more confident.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Here?
He was trying to get her to read the music the way he does,
Mm-hmm.
and to get the intensity and the emotion into playing that he puts into it.
Okay. Well, there are a few things that we know concretely. Yeah.
He also related it to the human voice, besides just what the music was actually saying. And she seemed to get it a little better when he said, if you were to say the music, it would be this way. And you would have to take a breath there as if you were actually speaking, or if you were singing. So if you were speaking the music, you would take a normal, natural breath here. She seemed to get it a little more when he related it to that type of thing.
Yeah. Anybody else? That idea is what you heard. He said, it speaks. The corrections were all about meaning. Every time he corrected her, he was showing her there's a different idea. He says, pause at the beginning. Then he says after that, it speaks. He says, it's not exactly what is written, but it means that. And he said, breath. Take a breath. Well, now, that's all about the human voice, but it's also about life. breathing, meaning. So that it's not an instrument. She wasn't playing an instrument. That's what he was basically trying to convey to her. You are not playing an instrument. You are saying something. You want to remember, maybe you don't know, people may not have a reason to know at this point, that Pablo Casals went into exile in protest against the Franco government. He had served in the Republican government of Spain. And he never returned to Spain from 1939 on. And he refused to play in any country that recognized Franco's fascist government of Spain until the very end of his life. He did make one exception, actually two exceptions, but he made an exception and he played at the White House because of Jacqueline Kennedy and John Kennedy. But it's important to recognize that there is no more political figure when it comes to music in the last 100 years than Pablo Casals. Wilhelm Furtwängler is also political. Those are both political cases, very different cases actually. Yehudi Menuhin, there's other people. But Casals, there had to be a whole festival created in a town in France, the Pride Festival, because Casals wouldn't go to America to record or any place else to record. And what happened was that some of the musicians, come to me in a minute, famous violinists from America, Alexander Schneider, as a young man, he organized the Pride Festival in France to bring everybody to Casals because Casals would not leave to go anywhere. So that's how that festival happened. So the whole musical world had to come to him because he refused to bend his principle about Franco's fascist Spain. Now, he was political not because he had a political ideology and he was also a musician. Matter of fact, his whole career had been sponsored by the Spanish monarchy. And as a Republican and as a member of the Ministry of Culture, he often gave speeches about that, praising the monarchy, even as he was a Republican official. So, just to set this in context, now what does this have to do with what we've been talking about so far? This is a little quote from Friedrich Schiller. He talks about the problem. Well, this is from the Mission of Moses. I'm going to start with this one. And he talks about the nation of the Hebrews must appear to us as an important universal historical people. And everything evil which one is accompanied to impute to this people, all the efforts of facetious minds to belittle this achievement, meaning monotheism, shall not prevent us from doing it justice. The disgrace and depravity of a nation cannot efface the sublime merits of its legislators, and just as little annul the great influence to which this nation makes just claim in world history. Useful to think about for today. The disgrace and depravity of a nation, such as ours, cannot efface the sublime merits of its legislators, such as the people that founded it, and just as little annul the great influence to which this nation makes just claim in world history. Now, why that's significant is that whenever you hear us, and you know we always say this, including now, including as we talk about the BRICS and we talk about South Africa and China and Russia and all this, we keep saying that the United States must play a not only decisive role, but the central role, even though there's no sign whatsoever that any institution in the United States is either listening to that, capable of that, inclined to that. But that's why we keep saying it, because not merely because we're saying it like Don Quixote style, right? We're just saying it to say it because it's the right thing to say. No, we're saying it because principles live as you saw in the music. This is the important idea. A musical score is not alive. And if you try to read the musical score as such, you will kill the music. You cannot do that. You have to reproduce that, you the living person, using the instrumentation that allows you to communicate with something that is not there. Evoke something which is otherwise invisible to the senses, but is playing on the shadow of the auditory perception of hearing. So something is being heard, but what is being heard is not the music. The thing that is being heard is the mind of the listener. That's all the mind, that's all the listener can hear. The listener cannot hear the music. The listener can only hear his or her own mind. And this idea of that which is beyond the sensual or the bestial is the core of the idea that I want to point out at this point from Augustine. This is from the section 7, living and knowing that one is alive. So he just has this. He says, can you make the distinction that it is one thing to live and another to know that one lives? And then Evodius says, well, I know that nobody, unless he is living, knows that he's alive, yet I do not know whether or not everything that lives knows that it's alive. And so Augustine then says, well, let's talk about that because, let's talk about beasts. He says, tell me whether you think it's possible that a beast, however fierce or huge or cunning, might try in its turn to make a man subject to itself in the way that you see people subjugate beasts. Matter of fact, he says, you have often seen that it's not only the body of the beast, but even its soul has been made subject to men. You have pets, you know what he's referring to. So he asked the question, could a beast do the same to a man? And Evodius says, I agree that this is not possible. And Augustine says, but then tell me, since it is evident that man is easily outdone by most beasts in strength and other physical attributes, what is it in which a man so excels that no beast can rule him, whereas man can rule many beasts? Is it perhaps what is usually called reason or understanding? Reason is ratio, understanding is intelligentsia. Evodius answers, I can discover nothing else, since that by which we excel beasts is in the spirits. So that by which we excel the beast is in the spirit. So the concept here is, how do we know that? How do we arrive at this idea of spirit? Now here, we refer back to the music, but I want to say something about these figures. Many of you have seen these before. Maybe some have not. Has anybody not seen these before? Anybody? Everybody seen these? Okay. We refer to these as the Platonic solids, but that's only because it happened to be the case that Plato, after his 12-year study in Egypt, and also Socrates earlier, developed, through their collaboration with the Temple of Ammon, which went way beyond just geometry, they developed a conception of teaching where the concept was to try to make visible the invisible. And the idea of these, I only didn't bring my, the idea of these is that, excuse me, I have my other props, but I didn't pull them out. Well, I just use these right now. And I have, I want to say something about it, that circular action, in this case, spherical action surrounding this. And of course, you have to generate a circle first. We are not doing that right now. But the idea of the figures, the so-called equal area solids, are constructions in which the idea, if these were surrounded by a sphere, for example, that in the rotation of this, it will always be equal to itself. That is, you will always see it. There are no, as in like a soccer ball or in other figures. They're equal area in rotation. And so there are 5 such figures. There are only 5 such figures. And we were not this week going to take up more than to say that there is a boundary, a natural boundary to construction in physical space, which means what makes it impossible to make more than these 3 figures. There are ratios contained among them, and there are relationships among them. As just one indicator, if I can get this in, I think I can do that.
Push, move it, flexible.
Yeah, just get it in like that. Okay, great. There you go. Yes. Very good. Thank you. These were constructed by my good friend and early teacher, Zeke. So that the figure that's encased here, the octahedron, is, you see now the square face of the cube, and you see that that there's a point, a vertex, and that face has a certain relationship to the side. What I want to show otherwise is, we can rotate these also, it will be true on all sides. And so this is called the dual. One of them, wherever you see a point, you'll see a face. And so the same is true over here. I'll show that in a moment too. The importance of showing these things is not the details of the geometry, but the idea that only these figures are constructible, and that limitation allows for a form of construction, a physical action, which is the boundary condition for physical action at that level of space. Now, this is not the boundary of our conception of space. It's not the boundary of our ability to think beyond this. We can think beyond this. But coming back for a moment to what you saw in the musical performance, there is an idea of freedom, which is that which we now have to decide whether we want. In Pablo Casals' teaching of the student, he was not, I will contend, attempting to get the student to play exactly as he played, because the student couldn't play exactly as he played, for many reasons. I mean, just the skill level is completely different. So he knows that the student can't do it. But he is concerned that the student say something. So when that person leaves and they go to talk to someone using the cello to talk to them, they've got to be saying something. That's important to him, because in other words, that person is going to leave his presence. And when he's not there, he wants that composition to be heard by another group of people who he will have no contact with, in as perfect a fashion as he has heard that composition and reproduced it himself. That's what he wants. So he can't get a replica, but more importantly, it is unlawful to get a replica. It's unlawful. Why? Because the individual human being is unique. If the human being is not unique, then the human being is irrelevant. Let me repeat this, because I know he'll get into an interesting question. I don't believe in reincarnation because I think that human existence is unique. I'm not asking you to believe that. But I therefore don't believe that I am coming back. And I don't believe that this consciousness as such reoccurs either. Because otherwise it would be trivial. Now, what's important here is the following. If what we do, if our moment here, if our time here is unique, then what do we do that in some fashion matches the uniqueness of that moment? And in what way do we recognize that? Now, Augustine talks about the idea that it's one thing to live and another thing to know you're alive. Okay, and he refers to that as the science of life or the knowledge of life, scientia vitae. So this is where the idea of principle comes in. Now what he says about these sorts of things, he says that number and the use of numbers and the concept of number is a very important area. Sorry, I gotta get my other, sorry, I just forgotten to put my other examples in my case. Got it. Yeah. And he uses this example in another dialogue. Actually, not in this one, but in a dialogue called The Immortality of the Soul. Here's what Augustine says. He says, if you have a circle, he said, he calls it the line drawn through the center of the circle. In our case, we don't call it a line drawn through the center of the circle. We say the circle folded on itself. Yes, in a so-called geometry class, they can refer to something called lines, but we don't allow that. What we do is everything must be constructed. And so that fold through the center of the circle, which can be done from any point, we can take any other fold like that or any other location. Augustine says that any of the black lines that we see here, we could make any number of them. We could make them much closer together or farther apart, but none of them will be equal to the red line. So no matter how small a division we make, how many of these lines we make, how much we subdivide the circle. If the circle, in other words, were twice its size, 12 times its size, 100 times its size, then only the action of folding the circle upon itself gives you one length which is unique. And that length cannot be equaled under any circumstances by any number, no matter how many of them. You can talk about so-called an infinite number of black lines. They'll always be shorter. At the same time, since I can take any point along the circumference of the circle and choose that point to make that fold, like that point or whatever, I can choose any position from which to start to create a line going through the center. But that is a unique length, and it is always the longest length. Okay, now, is anybody unclear about what I just said? In any way? Okay, if you're not unclear, here's what Augustine says about this. He says, now that will always be true. In other words, if you die tomorrow, this will be true. Before you were born, this was true. And going back generations and before there were people, even, in one sense, it was true. And if there were no people, later on, it would be true. Now he says the following. That means if it's always true that this partakes of the quality of eternity, this idea, because it's always true. It's eternally true. Now he says, now, that idea is inside of your mind. So he asks this question. Which is bigger? The container of something or that which it contains? if you put water in a glass, which is bigger, the water in the glass or the glass around it? Same? How can it be the same? Try it.
Glass around it.
The glass around it is bigger than the water it contains.
Because it has a container.
That's why it contains it. If your mind contains this idea, how big is your mind? If this idea is eternal,
Vast.
and your mind contains it, what does it mean? It means your mind cannot die.
Oh, yes?
Go with the opposite.
Didn't see that coming, did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
For goodness sake, don't let that paper get away.
Now, there's something that Schiller takes up in an essay called The Sublime, and we'll make this the conclusion for today. And he takes this up. He says, well, okay, we talk about freedom, and we talk about people being free. And he says, but I have a problem, because there's one way in which people are not free. And some of you know our chorus is now singing this thing by Brahms. It's a poem by Schiller, set to music by Brahms, called the Nania. And it says, even the beautiful must die. So Schiller says, you know, there's a problem. People don't want to die, but they have to. So if that's true, how is human freedom actually perfect? You have to die. So if you're restricted in this way, here's what he says about it, so I'll just read it. Precisely for this reason is nothing so unworthy of man as to suffer violence. For violence annuls man. Who does it to us disputes nothing less than our humanity. Who suffers it in a cowardly manner throws away his humanity. So he's not you know, he's. But this claim to absolute liberation from all that is violence seems to presuppose a being which possesses enough power to drive away from itself any other power. If it is found in a being who does not maintain the uppermost rank in the realm of force, so an unhappy contradiction arises between the instinct and the capacity. Man finds himself in this case, surrounded by numberless forces, which are all superior to him and play the master over him. He makes claim by his nature to suffer from no violence. By his understanding, he does indeed enhance his natural force in an artificial manner, and up to a certain point, he actually succeeds in becoming physically master over everything physical. For everything, the proverb says, there's a remedy, but not for death. But this single exception, if it actually is one in the strictest sense, would annul the whole notion of man. By no means can he be the being which wills, if there is even but a single case where he absolutely must what he does not will. This single terrible one, which he merely must, which he merely must and does not will accompany him as a ghost, and as is also actually the case among the majority of men, deliver them as a prey to the blind terrors of the fantasy. His boasted freedom is absolutely nothing if he is bound even in a single point. Of course, that is why you don't have 1,000 people at this meeting. I mean, let's be honest, let's get right to it. The reason you know that you don't have the support that you should have is because people think they're going to die if they support what you're talking about. Now, they may not say that to you in that way, but that's exactly what they claim to think. Now, we may argue that they don't actually think that, but it would take quite a bit to persuade them that they didn't think that if you were to get them to that level. First, they'll say they're not interested. And they'll say other things. They'll say you can never beat these people. And they say other things. They're too powerful. They say, well, what will you do if you replace Obama? And they go on and on and on and on, right? But the truth is, fundamentally and finally, they don't want to risk, they say. And then, of course, you ask, what is it that they risk? Well, it must be something very fundamental. It's like talking to a man that can't swim. Why is it that he can't swim? He's not swimming because he thinks he's going to die in the water. That's why he doesn't do it. And there may be reasons, and there may be occasions, and there may be things that occurred to him. Right? But that's what happens. So Schiller says this. Culture shall set man free and help him to fulfill his entire notion. It will make him capable of asserting his will, for man is the being who wills. So this issue of free choice of the will now comes full circle. Man is the being who wills. That's what makes us human. Our ability to will something. This is possible in two kinds of ways. Either actually, when man opposes violence with violence, when he as nature rules over nature. That's one way that you triumph. You don't get killed. You oppose violence with violence. So Schiller is not nonviolent, you see. Not that way. Or ideally, when he steps out of nature and so in regard to himself, annihilates the concept of violence, steps out of nature. What helps him to do the first thing is called physical culture. He means the militaries and all the other things we do. Now, thus were his freedom done for if it were capable of nothing other than physical culture. He ought, however, to be man without exception. Can he therefore no longer oppose to the physical forces a proportional physical force, so nothing else remains left to him in order except to annul altogether the relationship which is so disadvantageous to him, and to annihilate as a concept the violence that he must in fact suffer. To annihilate as a concept the violence that you must suffer. In scientific creativity, in the discovery of the laws of science, in the application of the laws of science in physical economy, in the application of the laws of scientific creativity as beauty in music, you annihilate the concept of violence by transcending yourself, by grasping, creating, inventing, discovering, and communicating eternal ideas. And only in this way can you, in this world, at this time, transcend that threat of the risk of your life, which truly can also be taken from you at any moment. We talked earlier about the issue of lust, this idea that it is the desire for things that you can't keep. And of course, people understand generally, we talked about fame and the other lower things, obviously what we said. But what about life? What was it that Martin Luther King meant when he said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life, longevity has its place, but I just like to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. What was he saying? What was he saying at the beginning of the speech when he said, you know, if I was standing at the beginning of space and time, and the Almighty asked me, Martin Luther King, in what era would you like to live? He began his speech to sanitation workers on a rain-swept night in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 3rd, saying to them, as you know, if I were standing at the beginning of space and time. They were illiterate. They didn't have a union. One of them had been pressed, had been crushed to death in a compactor, which is why the strike was going on. King was at the lowest point of his career. More unpopular than any time he had ever been. Why was he standing there that night, speaking to a group of people who supposedly couldn't understand? Talking to them about standing at the beginning of space and time and speaking to God. Why? And why did he say just before that, that, that he'd been on a plane and the plane had been checked for bombs? Why did he say before that, when I was in New York, I got stabbed by this woman, and it was very close to the aorta, and they said that if I had sneezed, I could drown in my own blood. It's all in the same speech. The entire speech from beginning to end was intended that night to defy his death 24 hours later. Look at the gospel according to St. Matthew. Look at any of the other gospels. You'll notice Christ's death is in 24 hours of his decision. Gethsemane. Martin Luther King did that in your lifetime. Most of it. Through free choice of the will. And he annihilated the concept of violence, which is what his entire mission of nonviolence had been. This is the standard of American citizenship today. Nothing less. It may not be demanded of you, but you must be prepared to think in such a way in order to be a disciple of the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution. So the founders did not make things easier for you. But that is the requirement. Would you be free today in America? And that is the only issue of Lyndon LaRouche, his notoriety, the fear that people have of him. That's the only issue. That is the standard, like the standard that Casals set for his student. If you will be free, are you willing to pay the cost of discipleship? Okay, that's it.